Ravi de vous retrouver pour la suite de
Pleasure
ce forum
to
franco-allemand de l'énergie
see you again
électrique
and
qui a lieu à
restart
une date
this
symbolique. On en a parlé, le
Franco-German
22
dialogue
janvier. Cette
online.
date en
It is taking place
1963,
on
la
a
signature
very
du
symbolic
traité
day.
de
It was on the
l'Élysée. Donc, on
22nd
est
of
vraiment
January
sous le signe de la
1963
coopération
that the Élysée Treaty was signed.
franco-allemande.
So we're
Autour de
really
ce thème,
at a
perspective
pivotal point
d'évolution
here
pour
of
le
the
design du marché de
Franco-German
l'électricité en Europe. Vous
dialogue,
êtes
and
nombreux à vous
we'll be
suivre.
looking
Je vous
now at the
remercie. Près de
electricity market
600
in Europe.
personnes qui nous suivent en
Roughly
ligne.
600
Je
people are
rappelle
following us
que les
online, and I'd just
présentations que
like
vous allez
to
avoir
recall that
dans
the
un instant, mais
presentations
également
that
tous
you
les
will be
enregistrements
witnessing
audio
shortly
seront disponibles
and
pour vous
all the
à
audio
partir du 4 février. On
recordings
va
will
donc
be
aborder
made
plus en
available to
détail le
everyone
sujet de la
as of the
réforme du
4th of
marché de
February. So
l'électricité dans
talking
l'Union
or
européenne,
getting
dont
back
on
to
a
the
parlé,
reform of the
avec des
electricity market
objectifs pour
design
protéger le
reform in the
climat,
European
les
Union with the
consommateurs et
objective of
assurer
protecting
les
climate, the
investissements. Pour
consumers,
en parler
and
en détail, on
ensure
est ravi
investment.
d'accueillir Madame
And
Mechthild
in order to
Förster.
get into the
Merci
details,
beaucoup
we
d'être
will now
avec nous.
turn to Mechthild
Bonjour,
Verstoffer.
vous êtes la
Thank you very much for
directrice
joining
générale
us. You are
adjointe
the
de l'énergie
Deputy
au sein de
Director
la
General for
Commission
Energy
européenne.
at the
Je
European
vous passe
Commission.
la parole pour
And
cette
you have the
présentation. Et puis on
floor
va
for your
ensuite avoir une
presentation,
ou deux
following
questions du
which we
public.
will
Merci, je
then
vous passe
take
la parole
questions from the
à la
audience. Thank you
directrice
very
générale
much.
adjointe de
As I
l'énergie.
said, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup
Thank you
und
very
guten
much.
Morgen aus Brüssel. Es ist
Good
mir eine
morning.
Freude, heute bei dem
Here in
französisch-deutschen
Brussels, I'm
Energieforum dabei zu sein
very
und
pleased to join
insbesondere
the
um zu diesem
Franco-German Energy
Thema
Forum today and
Efficient
talk about the
Electricity
topic of
Strommarktdesign zu reden.
the electricity
Meine
market
Slides sind auf
design
Englisch. Ich versuche es
in
auf Deutsch
Europe.
zu machen.
My slides are in English. I'll
Das Timing ist natürlich, wie es
continue to
gerade
speak
benannt worden
German,
ist, von
though,
heute Morgen schon
and
im Hinblick auf die deutsch-französischen
already, as was mentioned this morning,
Beziehungen
and with regard to the
historisch
Franco-German
wirklich wichtig. Ich muss
relations,
auch
they have been
sagen,
historically very, very
bei der
important.
Erarbeitung des
I'd like to add that
Strommarktdesign, der Reform, die ich
in
jetzt gleich vorstellen
establishing
würde,
this
gab es
electricity
auch eine
market
sehr gute
design
Zusammenarbeit zwischen
and
Frankreich,
within the
Deutschland
context of the
und der
reform, there was a
Europäischen
very
Kommission,
close coordination
damit dieser
between
Strombinnenmarkt, überhaupt
Germany,
der
France, and the European
Energiebinnenmarkt
Commission.
ist extrem
This
wichtig.
electricity
Wie Sie
market, this
wissen, haben wir seit 1. Dezember eine
single
neue
electricity
Kommission in
market is very
Brüssel.
important. As you know,
Präsidentin von der Leyen
in
macht ihr
December, a
zweites
new
Mandat. Wir
commission
haben
took
Teresa
office. Ms. von der
Riviera
Leyen
als
has
Ministerin oder
taken on her second
Vizepräsidentin
mandate, and
unter
we
anderem
also
für
have
Energie
a vice
und für
president for energy,
Energiekommissar
and we also have a
Jörgensen.
commissioner,
Und das
Jorgensen,
Thema
who is also in charge of
Energiepreise,
energy. And this topic of
Wettbewerbsfähigkeit,
energy prices,
Clean Industrial Deal, aber auch
competitiveness, clean
Binnenmarkt
industrial
sind
deal, but also
zentrale
the single
Themen
market
auch der neuen
are
Kommission.
central
Das
topics
heißt auf
for
der einen
the
Seite eine
work also of
Fortsetzung
the
von
new
dem,
commission. So
was
it
wir
is
im letzten
an
Mandat
extension,
alles
really, and continuation
angenommen
of what
haben.
we
Und da
have
darf ich
taken
dann
up in the last
insbesondere auf das
mandate.
Strommarktdesign zu
And I'll
sprechen.
be
Das ist
shortly
ein Kernstück,
focusing on the
den wir zusammen
electricity
verabschiedet
market
haben.
design.
Wir
This
wissen
was one
auch,
of the
dass
core pieces
der
that we
Binnenmarkt im
adopted. But we also know
Energiebereich,
that the
es
single
ist sehr viel
market in the area of
passiert. Wir
energy,
müssen das Strommarktdesign umsetzen, aber
a
es
lot
bleiben
has
auch
happened
noch
there. We need
neue
to implement
Themen
the
für dieses
electricity
Mandat,
market
die
design,
ich
but
ganz
there
am
are
Ende
new topics
meiner
as well
Rede
that have
auch
popped up that I
erwähne.
will also
Also
touch
der
upon at the end
Fokus
of my
bleibt
presentation.
bei
The
European
focus
Green Deal und Klima.
is
Da
still with
bleibt,
the
wie
European Green
wir die
Deal and
Konsumenten
climate.
besser
The focus
an der
is and continues to be on how
Energietransition
we can
beteiligen können. Wir brauchen ganz dringend
allow consumers to better
Investitionen,
participate in the
aber wir
energy
müssen auch
transition.
im
We need better
Hinblick auf
investment,
Affordable
but
Energy,
with a view
also
to
Preise,
affordable
die
energy,
bezahlbar
we
sind,
need
sowohl für
prices
die
that
Industrie
are
als auch für die
affordable,
Bürger,
both for the
nochmal
industry
ganz
as well as
bewusst
for
gucken, was
citizens in
können wir
general. And
machen,
therefore, we need to
um unsere
look exactly at
Wettbewerbsfähigkeit zu
what we can do
stärken,
in order
um
to
unsere
strengthen our
Bürger
competitiveness,
mitzunehmen. Und das
in order
neue
to
Mandat der
ensure
Kommission
that everyone
ist
is
da
on board.
wirklich
And the
ein
new
guter
mandate of the
Einstieg. Die
committee
Rede von
is, or the commission
Präsidentin
is a
gestern in
good starting
Davos
point. The
von der
speech
Leyen hat
delivered
auch
by
dazu
President
gesprochen,
of the
auch was wir im
Commission
Bereich
von der
Klima
Leyen
machen.
in Davos
Also das war eine kurze
explicitly also
Einführung,
touched
wo wir
on what we're
sind.
doing in the energy
Vielleicht können Sie
sector.
jetzt das erste
So
Slide
this
schon
as an
zeigen.
introduction, maybe you can pull up the first
Wir
slide.
hatten kurz rückblickend
So just
in dem
looking
letzten
back,
Mandat
taking stock,
viele
the last
Herausforderungen,
mandate we had to face
von
numerous
der
challenges
Covid-Krise natürlich,
due to the COVID
hauptsächlich im
pandemic
Energiebereich,
and in the energy sector,
wahrscheinlich sehr unerwartet,
rather
dass
unexpectedly
auf
so,
einmal Russland nicht nur die Ukraine besetzt
on
hat am 24.
the
Februar
back of the invasion of Russia,
2022,
Russia's
sondern
invasion of
auch
Ukraine in February
Energie
2022,
eingesetzt hat als Waffe.
But in addition to that, also started weaponizing, Russia started weaponizing energy, and 45% of the imports of natural gas at that point in time came from Russia. Also in Germany and other member states, the dependency was high. We reduced that in the last 3 years to a maximum of 19% of natural gas. In terms of imports from Russia, and we want to reduce that even further. We want to become more independent, and we want to diversify our energy mix, and we want to promote and foster renewable energies and local nuclear power generation in order to reduce the share of fossil fuels and the high imports. The effects of the crisis in 2022, 2023 were extremely high energy prices with a peak in August 2022, and following which we decided to adopt numerous measures, but also to reduce the dependency on resources, fossil fuel resources that are imported, and to increase the efficiency and accelerate the efficiency of renewable energies. And that is why we set up the reform of the electricity market and made a proposal. Following slide, please. I'd say that we established this proposal in a record time, given that there were substantial debates also in the run-up of the adoption of the Commission proposal that was put forward in March 2023. From March to December, we had very intensive rounds of debate and negotiations with all member states, but in particular with Germany. In France, we then adopted in May the proposal in the Council of Ministers. It has entered into force in July, and the member states have time, or had time until the 17th of January to implement all of this. So it's a very tight schedule. It's also very important that the member states quickly implement what has been decided, because it contains so many elements that aims to stave off the volatility of energy prices, that strengthens the single market and increases protection to the consumer. And therefore, this is an appeal to everyone, including Germany and France, to quickly implement this directive. Now, the next country, or the next slide, please. So what is the main topic in this reform? I've singled out 4 here. We want to strengthen power purchase agreements that are private agreements. We looked at what hurdles exist and why does it work in some instances better and in other instances less. What can we on the Commission side do in order to provide an input, an impulse to the member states that it is further implemented? And then it's also another element here in order to stabilize the prices, which are the contracts for difference. Another important topic is flexibility. How can we balance or calibrate better the relation between supply and demand, including solutions that are not gas-powered utilities or coal-powered utilities? And the last one is the forward markets. How can we get a better grip, a better handle on that? Next slide. And I'd like to further delve into the individual topics here. Referring to price signals, we want to ensure that member states simplify and facilitate power purchase agreements. There are countries that are already doing this, and on this note, I'd like to thank Germany and France as well, who have submitted their national climate plans running up to 2030. And in so doing, the member states actually supply to us their trajectory, how they want to achieve this trilogy of energy efficiency, renewable energies, and decarbonization by 2030. We will look at how they are achieving this, and this includes also that the member states lay out in concrete terms what they're doing in order to facilitate these power purchase agreements. Same but not identical against the same backdrop. the state as a player also comes in, and this is where we turn to the contracts for difference. And we propose certain principles here in order to ensure efficiency and in order to reduce the systemic costs, if you will. And this is really a salient topic when it comes to energy prices. How can we make the entire system more efficient without distorting competitiveness or the competition? So these contracts for difference are an additional tool in the toolbox that we need to use. Third element, and mind you, all of these, all four criteria have to be seen jointly. Currently, we're looking at what non-fossil flexibility solutions could entail. It's also important for our energy invoices. Sophie Morland and Mr. Nimmermann already mentioned this in the previous session. Our aim is really to adopt all possibilities of demand and supply and storage facilities to achieve this. And that isn't the case yet. There's still a lot of untapped potential in terms of pump storage in order to influence the demand side. And we have asked for a methodology to be provided by ACER, the Association of the Energy Regulators. And then we need to do an evaluation of national flexibility measures by next summer. So this topic, flexibility, will be pushed extremely hard.
Das machen wir. Wir sind schon dabei, die Möglichkeiten
as we speak, we're already assessing the possibilities in this sense, and the legislative text for the electricity market design includes measures, hedging measures, and the improvement of hedging measures. And by January 2026, this should be in place. All stakeholders will be consulted to this effect. All of these instruments that I've just laid out, seen jointly, will lead to a situation where the invoices will be lower and we will have more affordability in terms of prices. That is the salient topic, and it provides also more certainty in the midterm to facilitate investments, the necessary investments that we need for all renewable low-carbon solutions. Also, the grids will be benefiting or stand to benefit from this. Next slide, please. So in addition to this objective of price stabilization, there is a second objective enshrined within the market reform, which is explicitly directed at consumers. We're talking about citizens, but also small and medium-sized enterprises, small bakeries, and others that are also suffering from the energy crisis and the high energy pricing or prices. And in some cases, also the energy-intensive industries that have also been suffering from high energy prices. So we're looking at the consumers here. On the one hand side, we want to protect them better, even if, God forbid, there should be another crisis. But we also want to include them more in our efforts geared at the energy transition. So we want more offers. We have the fixed price and the variable price contracts. And everyone needs to make sure, and this is something that we demand from our member states, and that they make sure that this takes place, that there is a diversity of choices for the consumer. In some crises, or in some countries, it was the case that consumers were not able to sign fixed price contracts anymore. So it should be safeguarded that there is a choice and different options are available. Another topic that I'd like to mention is the smart meter and dynamic pricing possibility. And we need to include them. This is another tool that, as we speak, has not yet been fully implemented in all member states. And better communication is required on all levels. We oblige the providers to provide better information on their websites and their contracts and to adhere to the contractual clauses and to make sure that the consumer has this information and can use it. Strong focus during the crisis was also that more and more, or the acknowledgement that more and more households were no longer paying their energy bills. This was not just affecting lower class, poorer consumers, but also middle class, so to speak. And we want to protect the energy poor consumers and those who are at a disadvantage, so that those that, even if they cannot pay their bills for a certain reason, are not disconnected. So we want to avoid disconnections. The last important topic is topic of energy sharing and energy communities. A lot is happening both in France and in Germany. On the one hand, consumers stand to benefit in a better way, even if they if they can combine their photovoltaic installation on their roof with other installations or similar installations in their neighborhood. This is also an element in our market reform. And then the topic of energy communities. This is where citizens come together, set up a joint community in order to tap into the possibilities, including dynamic pricing. This is something that has already been taken up very positively in most member countries, unfortunately not in all. So those are the main or salient elements of our reform. Deadline was 17th of January 2025. We will be analyzing what the status quo is and hopefully very soon provide a report. My next slide touches on two topics that the Commission is currently working on. It is set upon the electricity market design reform. We have an action plan for affordable energy, and I'd like to enumerate what we're doing there. Together with the industrial deal, at the end of February, this will be put forth by the Commission, and later on in the year, we will also have an action plan on electrification. We do see that more can be done, and we will be looking at removing hurdles on electrification and try to draw up pathways as to how we can promote electrification in the various sectors. I think in so doing, I can finalize my presentation at this point, and thank you for your attention. So we have time for questions now. Thank you, Mechtel Wörsdorfer, for this presentation. I have two questions that have been put forward by the audience, and I would like to ask you to provide as effective and concise an answer as possible, because we will also be looking on other topics here. What you, both in France and Germany, you spoke about the capacity mechanisms, and what could the European Commission do to promote and facilitate the adoption of these capacity mechanisms? Thank you very much for this question. The topic of capacity mechanisms is included in, or we did not explicitly include that in the reform of the electricity market design. We believe that it is a very important topic, that has really developed, and something that we have to do, something that will be published in the next couple of weeks. Criticism that we've taken up from the member countries is that the procedures at the Commission, GD competition, GD energy, that we streamline all of these procedures. And a proposal to this effect will be tabled in the next couple of weeks, so that those countries who want to introduce capacity mechanisms, that we will then accelerate our approval procedures so that security and certainty is provided for investments. Thank you very much. We have another question. We've talked a lot about grids, and we will come back to that this afternoon. Philippe Nimmermann spoke about standardization. We're looking about financing, a European mechanism to that effect, in terms of financing, that is. Could that be conceivable? Yes, thank you very much. Also, that is also a very, very important topic. The grids, the networks are very, very important for a very important element for the energy transition. We're looking at various points there. We're looking at necessary investments, the grid fees. What can we improve there? And we're really looking forward to all proposals in that sense. And at the end of the year, we will also use our planning tool for network and energy. And the idea is to set priorities at the EU level for EU added value for interconnectors of the networks, particularly with a view also on interconnectors for the electricity market. So we will be looking at that also in terms of fees. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for your answers to these two questions. Mechthild Westava, Deputy General Director for the Energy at the European Commission. You've talked about PPAs and the setting up of CFDs, other elements of flexibility. We will see how this will be implemented in France and in Germany. And we will be starting with France, with Laurent Cueny. Hello.
You're the Director for Energy at the French Ministry of the Economy, Finance and Industrial and Digital Sovereignty. So I'll hand over to you for 50 minutes for your presentation. After that, we'll have some questions. Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be able to talk to you at this 7th Franco-German Energy Forum on this very important anniversary. I'm sure that cooperation between our countries is crucial, cooperation between our countries. We have this challenge of security of supply, climate change, and the need to maintain economic competitiveness, particularly for our industry within the EU. And I'm delighted to talk after Mechthild and before André Puschmann. Throughout 2024, we've been looking with André at boosting cooperation between our teams. After a number of statements between our ministers, we want to work together to implement the EMD reform and to move forward on developing the electrical grid, the cost of that grid, innovation and flexibility of our systems. So I would like briefly to talk to you about implementation of the future European electricity market design.
Slide suivant. Encore un.
Let's keep going on the slides. There we are. The energy price crisis in autumn 2022 showed that there are limits to the framework of the European electricity market. France was therefore delighted about the compromise on European reform of the electricity market. That's crucial to attain climate neutrality because it facilitates decarbonized electrification of the member states. It's good for consumers because it makes it possible for consumers to boost their purchasing power because the price paid by consumers will be closer to the cost of generating their electrical mix. It's also good for those who produce electricity. The reform will create tools to secure investments in generation capacity for decarbonized electricity. Moving on, I'd like to address a number of mechanisms that seem to be absolutely vital because they underpin and support electrification in the interest of consumers, which is the key to our success in decarbonization. One of the key measures for France is tools to protect consumers from the inherent volatility in wholesale electricity markets. The idea in these tools is to create long-term price signals, and that will protect investments into generation facilities, but also protect consumers. These are PPAs CFDs and a greater focus on forward markets. So first of all, developing power purchase agreements, PPAs. They link a producer and an end user for several years. We have our multi-annual energy programming in France, and in that context, we support the establishment of hybrid public sector support for PPA and CFDs for renewable energies. There's an obligation to structure all direct public aid for new generation capacities for decarbonised electricity in the form of contracts for difference, CFD. They offer twofold protection to producers and to consumers against short-term fluctuation in the market. And the idea is that all of the revenue generated will be redistributed for all consumers, which is vital to cut electricity bills and protect consumers if there are high market prices for a longer term. We're looking at setting up a CFD to fund the new nuclear program in France. And some of the revenue from our existing nuclear program is to be distributed to consumers in the months to come as well. This reform also makes it possible to strengthen protection of electricity consumers vis-à-vis practice by certain suppliers by improving the general framework and making the information more legible. They'll have the right to a fixed-term, fixed-price contract. There'll be prudential constraints on suppliers, and we'll make sure that they will stick to those. And there'll also be greater level of guarantees. There is going to be the supplier of last resort introduced, protection against being cut off from the networks, and scope to have access to affordable electricity if there is a crisis. This will help France to introduce protection against aggressive commercial practices that are not terribly resilient. There's prudential regulation to deal with risky strategies on the part of suppliers. And it means that the surveillance bodies that are monitoring the market will have more tools at their disposal. We also want to simplify the capacity mechanism, and the new market reform also includes promising provisions for developing flexibility on the market. We regularly address this with our colleagues from Germany. Making the market and the grid flexible is crucial as a function of the means of production, which in some cases fluctuate. That's intermittent production, for example, in the case of renewables. So we want to provide mechanisms to support that flexibility. In that spirit, in 2024, a Franco-German group was set up to boost cooperation and have an exchange on various different forms of cooperation and different practices that could be implemented on both sides of the Rhine. So moving on to the next slide now. What you see here is an excerpt from one of the statements that I mentioned before that our ministers agreed upon in the course of 2024, and that relates to general principles. So with a view to attaining our climate goals and against the backdrop of increasing electrification of uses, our two countries note that flexibility is a vital tool for energy transition. Flexibility makes it possible to ensure security of supply, to optimize the operation of the electrical system, guaranteeing price competitiveness and boosting European competitiveness as well. Our countries face the same challenge, making the most of the potential offered by flexibility to finding coherent, appropriate means to address this through the national energy policy and also through an interconnected European electricity grid. In the margins of the Energy Council on the 4th of March 2024, we addressed this point, which was on the agenda there. There we adopted a joint declaration between France and Germany. That was where we launched the working group looking at the flexibility of the electrical system. And of course, our ministers give a lot of political support to this too. Since March 2024, we've had extensive technical level exchanges between our ministries. And we regularly inform our ministers in the margins of the councils of precisely the progress that we're making on this cooperation. We want to have a roadmap on flexibility and topics that are very important across the board for the EU, but specifically and in particular for the French and German electricity markets. So within this context of the technical level exchanges that I mentioned, we've touched on a whole host of topics relating to our policies on flexibility, the levers that we use in association with that, responding to demand, battery storage, generation means dispatching and the grid infrastructure as well. We focus on a roadmap, as I said, with a lot of shared definition of the order of magnitude. We want to overcome potential lack of flexibility, and we want to have greater flexibility so that supply and demand can match better. We also have monitoring of electricity consumption in terms of the time of use. There's differentiated pricing based on time slots. And the idea there is to have market response to pricing signals, but also to protect consumers against excessively high level prices. So we have periods which are high demand, periods which are low demand, and there's also pricing structures with floating pricing as well. Our discussions within the European context have addressed implementation of European market reform, the grid code on response to demand in order to boost flexibility within the European energy system, all against the backdrop of the EU's regulation and directives on this. And the working group has taken steps to ensure that we have storage measures that focus on and complement renewables. We've also looked at the rights and duties of producers. We've got an exchange of good practice and recommendations to ensure that development is well coordinated. And we've sought to move ahead on developing market products, solar peaks or sun peaks, which Sophie talked about earlier. We're convinced that these carefully adapted mechanisms will send out a very clear price signal to consumers so they consume at the best possible point in time. And we want to ensure that we can integrate renewables better into the grid as well. We've got contact with our German partners on this so that we can mesh the new mobility solutions and also to connect that up with the option for storing energy in vehicles. Plus, we have feed-in to grid. So all of these innovations, which we're discussing with our German counterparts, make it possible for us to manage balancing of the network, even when there is pronounced variability of production. And that's very important when you're looking as well at smart networks. Smart grids are part and parcel of this whole, so it's very promising working group, this flexibility working group. We're very ambitious in this group, and we'll be moving forward over the months to come to make the electricity markets on both sides of the Rhine more flexible. We also want to contribute to dialogue at the European level. France and Germany, of course, are key players within the European energy market. Getting together on a bilateral basis is very helpful in seeking to develop market rules at the European level and to discuss the way in which those new rules are implemented. I don't want to talk any greater length. We hope we'll have time for questions. Thank you very much for that presentation. Yes, we'll take some questions before hearing from Mr. André Poschmann, who'll be telling us about the situation in implementation in Germany. I wonder whether you've got an implementation schedule for implementation of this European reform in France. Well, yes, we're working on that at the technical level on transforming the electricity market. As soon as we have the right kind of legislative framework, we're looking for the right legislative framework for this. Work is underway on that. Transposition into French law will be based on analysis of requirements in France, boosting protection of consumers, the obligation to have a flexible pricing, and also to inform consumers before they conclude contracts. That's part and parcel of transposition of the new European provisions. This reform of the electricity market design seeks to avoid the problems we've had over the last few years. If there were to be a new crisis in energy pricing, thoughts already been given by the state, it seems, to provisions. Is that correct? Well, yes, there are all these prudential provisions on suppliers. For example, I don't want to go into all of the details, but there are these provisions that will help us to get to grips with the crisis. We've got something we're experimenting with in France, an asymmetric provision. I touched on it very briefly in my presentation. The idea is that when prices rise above a certain threshold, there's going to be two, in fact, the dividends from the existing nuclear park will be removed from this. 50% of the profit will be taken off, and will also take off 80% of this. It's to do with windfall profits, excessive pricing. That will mean that we'll be able to redistribute to consumers this additional profitability, which comes from the nuclear pricing levels and profitability. And we think that that will mean that we'll be able to get to grips with the situation better than was the case in the previous crisis. This mechanism will already be enforced because we'll be able to have this kind of windfall levy almost. It's a bit like what you have in CFDs, but this is structured asymmetrically. It's only if there is high pricing. There's no guaranteed revenue if there's a drop in pricing, and the mechanism is there in response to the crisis caused by the war in Ukraine in 2022. Well, yes, one final point. You talked about state aid, public support, coordination between the PPA and the CFD. We talked about the industry as well. There's a lot of small-scale consumers, though, as well, who would like perhaps to have access to PPA and other forms of supply. Are you going to be working with them? How are you going to be reaching out to these smaller-scale consumers? There's a whole host of provisions that we have up our sleeve for these smaller-scale consumers. For those who use a lot of electricity, for example, there's our current mechanism for nuclear pricing that's going to lapse in the course of this year, and they will have access to a particular mechanism which will allow those in electro who make intensive use of electricity to have a so-called simplified contract that have an alternative funding mechanism which will run for several years, and that will tie in the price. It's currently being set up. It's not actually in place yet. Those involved have not yet agreed upon it. The prices are still low, but if the prices were to go up, then it would become interesting once again. They would have this option, as I said, to secure, just tie in the prices. For example, you're thinking about people like bakers, for example, who are have intensive use of electricity. They could have this medium-term contract to tie in the prices. We looked at all consumers, all kinds of measures that we're addressing as well for those who are making hyper high consumption. The idea is that EDF should be able to offer shared risk contracts to safeguard and tie in prices for the medium term. The idea is that consumers will have access to hedge their bets, so to speak, in the medium term. A market is becoming established. It's now possible in France to have a 5-year contract without any problems. So we have all of these different measures, the PPA, the simplified nuclear contracts, and the medium-term contracts, which will allow consumers of whatever size to have access to products that will ensure that their needs are covered at a reasonable price for the medium term. This will help them to overcome short-term glitches if prices are very high for a short period. That's the kind of thing that we're working on. And we've been working on them, in fact, for nearly a year by now. Well, thank you very much to Laurent. Thank you very much for your information. That was very helpful. Thank you to Laurent Cuny, Director for Energy, French Ministry of the Economy, Finance and Industrial and Digital Sovereignty. And thank you for replying to your questions, for talking about the EMD. And you mentioned André Poschmann, who is with us now. He's going to be talking about implementation of the reform of the EMD. So good afternoon to you.
And he is the Deputy Director General, responsible for overall issues of electricity and European energy policy at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action. I'm giving him the floor for 15 minutes to talk to us about the implementation of the reform in Germany. Thank you, Mr. Poschmann. You have the floor.
Oh, hello, everyone, and the conference.
Yes, thank you, and hello to the conference. As you've heard, I'm André Poschmann, and I'm Deputy DG here at the Ministry, responsible for EU energy policy and German electricity policy.
We are discussing regarding our national concerns and the EU debate. Can I have the next slide?
Sie müssen auf Deutsch sprechen, damit die Übersetzer übersetzen können.
Okay. Then I switch to German for the translation. Meine Agenda heute.
Okay, so we'll do that in German. The agenda I want to talk about today will mean starting with a few facts and figures from Germany. Then we'll talk about the electricity market reform, how we assess it, how we are implementing it, and then I'll look ahead at the future electricity market design, and then place a spotlight on electricity because we have a very important project ahead with France on flexibility. In Germany, we've made a lot of progress on grid expansion and the expansion of renewables. We now have 80% share of the market, thanks to a number of different measures that have been taken to improve capacity. One very important aspect has been speeding up permitting processes, thanks to EU regulations that have made that possible for us. The statutory surge charge that we were applying to renewable energies has been abolished. This has aided domestic households, and we're now enabling municipalities to participate financially in these solar and wind projects.
Der Konsumenten und aber auch der municipalities vor Ort. Und wir haben mehrere andere Maßnahmen.
We have a number of other measures, such as our wind package, our solar package. There are a number of things going on. But I would like to particularly emphasize the acceleration of the planning and approval procedures, which have really helped us move on this year and last year. These are some gigawatt statistics for you. With wind, we're at 63. That's about half of the expansion we want to achieve by 2030. We've achieved a great deal, but there's still a way to go, especially with photovoltaics. We've really seen a boom recently. In the last 2 years, 15 gigawatts. Wind is lagging behind a little bit, but we can see from the next slide that the approvals for wind have certainly increased, so that in 2024-25 we had an increase of 15 gigawatts in wind, and much of that was due to the acceleration of the planning and approval procedures. It really has helped. As we look ahead, probably the most important drivers for this will need to continue the process because that has been such a big success factor. On the next slide, we can see another important factor. We're looking increasingly at storage. So far, we've seen quite a lot of expansion in storage, up to almost 18 gigawatt hours. But what's more important is the number of requests we're getting for connections to the grid, which now amount to 230 gigawatts in the pipeline. Now, that's not a realistic figure in the sense they won't all happen. But if a realistic proportion of those requests convert into reality, then it's not only the next step in the energy transition, it means we'll have reached a new level. It'll be a completely new world, and it'll give us completely new potential for photovoltaics, wind, and battery. Together, they can get us through the day in a completely new way. And the main driver for that is really the market. The changes in the power prices. You can see the gradient and the way it changes when these prices go up during the day. Then, of course, in the evening, there's a fall off. And how we deal with that, needs to be a business case for that. So we have to address market barriers and permit these battery storage strategies to enter the market. We have some specific measures for that, but it's a great signal to see that the prices for storage have fallen, and we're getting a new player in the market that we've all been waiting for a long time and who's about to turn up to the party. Looking at the next slide, on grid expansion, that remains a big challenge for the energy transition, especially if you look at the north-south axis. Where we're lagging behind a little, we have bottlenecks there. We have to work with these congestions and with redispatch. But there's some good news there too, because here too, the approval and planning procedures have certainly speeded up. We've achieved 5 times as many kilometers in 2024 as we did in 2021. So that is a complete acceleration thanks to these faster approval procedures. We've already built about 22,000 kilometers, and we've got another 16,000 in planning. These are also European investments within the EU single market, and all of us are benefiting from this. But of course, it's a difficult task and it costs a lot of money. But we need to do it, though, and it will make our electricity prices cheaper across Europe. So let me come on to the next topic, which is the market reform, how we assess it, and how we're implementing it. Here we can see the German perspective on this. It was important because it was a main purpose of the reform in the light of the energy crisis to shield consumers from very high prices. That was the main aim, and that is important. We supported that. There are a few measures there which relate to the long-term progress of the energy transition. That's important too. Others are only in the first phase, but we need to carry on assessing them in the future. Something that's particularly important is that we have energy sharing. We've been able to reinforce that for domestic households and for small and medium-sized companies, SMEs. We have our PPAs so that we've reduced the barriers for renewable PPAs. And with a new top-up tender, we've been able to see EU tenders. We have cooperation tenders. That's a fine example that we can now achieve. And that helps us to see perhaps what is still lacking. These EU tenders are a very positive development. They can perhaps help us reach the 45% target. We've reinforced intraday trading. notably cross-border trading up to 30 minutes before delivery. That's very important. So we have shorter product times. And on the important issue of flexibility, we've laid the ground for an EU flexibility roadmap with indicative targets and reporting. That's very important because we can only tackle that at European level. Implementation on the next slide. Here you can see that we have implementation periods of up to 2 years. We're just adopting a measure at the moment as we talk. In November, we agreed on a cabinet decision, and now we're trying to implement that. But because we have suddenly elections in Germany, unfortunately, we're not going to get this package probably through Parliament in the current legislative period. So this package will probably be implemented under the new government. So we've been thwarted a little by these sudden elections, but I'm sure that in September or so, we'll be seeing this under a new government. On the next slide, we come to the outlook, the view ahead, and that's important in terms of the future for the electricity market design. Let's start with the outlook from our point of view. And it's a European point of view, of course. Let me just briefly say that there was a tough debate in Germany about how we will change our market design. I didn't bring that slide along today, but let me say a couple of sentences about that. We've had a long process in Germany for a year with a platform involving all stakeholders in climate neutrality, where we discussed with everyone flexibility, localization, investment framework for power stations, for renewables. And we talked about all the measures, and we formulated a concrete option paper at the ministry based on that debate on the platform climate neutral options. And we discussed it with our neighbors too. From that, we've derived some specific measures. For example, the introduction of a capacity market, where we need to decide on a model and a power station strategy, tenders for that as a first step towards a capacity market. And there are other steps too. This feeds into the flexibility roadmap and other things. A lot of these points, because of the new elections, will have to be picked up with a new government and a new parliament, but that's the status quo of our discussion in Germany around the market reform. And I'm sure that a lot of these points will come back in the new parliament, because we didn't have this discussion by ourselves. We discussed with stakeholders across the country. So what you find in the paper reflects what the world of electricity thinks across Germany. There are a couple of other issues I'd like to quickly mention. One is the system stability roadmap, which we've drawn up in Germany, where we discuss what this means with all the stakeholders. What do we need to do so that we have a 100% renewable system in the future? It's not just one measure. There are hundreds of different measures. And that's a very important process. I'll come back to it in a moment with regard to Europe. And we've got the problem of the PV peaks, where we saw such a huge development last year with so many new photovoltaic systems coming into the system, and we had temporary spikes. So how do you deal with those? And we agreed on a package there in the cabinet, which once again won't quite get through Parliament, but there is a whole cluster of measures there based on 3 pillars. The first pillar, more market integration, more incentives for PV installations to respond to market signals, not to support negative prices, premiums. The central pillar a role for the network operators so that they can curtail some of those photovoltaic installations if required. And then there's a final pillar which is designed to generating more flexibility on the demand side, which brings me to this. Can we go back?
Genau, das führt mich zu dieser Slide. Kommen wir wieder zurück zur europäischen Debatte.
We'll come back to the European debate. We can see that as a result of the discussion around the Green Deal and the EU emergency measures, a great deal was achieved, especially in expanding renewables. We're on the right path. There's still a lot to do. But of course, we still have challenges. Everyone's talking about them at the moment. Europe is no longer competitive. Power prices are often too high. We've got various structural problems, including in Germany. And across the board, as far as competitiveness and affordable prices are concerned, this has caused a lot of discussion in Germany. But what are the conclusions? Our major point would be that we should not so much focus on short-term crisis response measures and implementing those in the market, but should look above all at the structural measures, how we can reduce prices across Europe structurally. That's important for competitive industry. Once we know how to do that, we can start to think about what we want to do in the next few years to preserve competitiveness until those structural measures kick in. But structure first is our approach. And we need to do that above all in these three fields. Make fast progress with renewables so that we've got more hours with cheap prices. Then storage and flexibilization need to be moved ahead so that Europe as a whole can benefit more from us, so that we can spread it across more hours, this cheaper power. And thirdly, this cross-border infrastructure that we want to expand so that the whole of Europe can benefit. That, in the long term, is the structural pathway. And we will need a number of measures to achieve that, complemented by other steps to achieve competitiveness in the next few years. Let's begin with grid tariffs, for example. But as far as market reform is concerned, these are the decisive measures. So on the next slide, just briefly, I have something about price spikes and what we do when there's no sun and no wind, because we've had a number of periods like that in recent weeks. These are situations where within a few hours we can see the prices rising very high because there's no sun and no wind. That's what we call the Dunkelflaute. And we've seen a very specific situation this year because in recent years we haven't had so little wind. Of course, that affects the competitiveness, and it's not many hours, so it's not going to affect average power price, but politically, it's been important to discuss how we would respond to that. An important message from our point of view is that the prices on average are still falling. If we look at the futures above all, which is like the market's prediction for how prices are likely to develop, we can see lower prices, considerably lower, down to 70 euros, because the market expects more storage, more renewables to come into play. But we need to respond in the short term. And one important figure for you here is that just 100 or 150 megawatt more of these hours across Europe would have been enough to halve the price during those hours. So in Germany and in Europe, we need to tap into those flexibilities. We need to develop storage. 150 megawatts isn't a lot. We just need to make absolutely sure that we permit cross-border trading during such hours and that the rules apply. And then we can manage those hours and are not as much a problem as it appears in the political debate. On the next slide, We have appeal for system stability. We need to discuss that at European level. We think that a lot of the challenges that we are seeing across Europe will appear, and we at least need to develop a European strategy for dealing with those critical 100 to 200 hours. What rules should apply? And it's very important for us that we're going to need more European-wide redispatch. The TSOs and DSOs will have to play a bigger part. We saw in the last clean energy package that European cooperation needs to be achieved at network level. How we achieve that with these regional operation security centers, the ROSC aspect, that actually has to be implemented, because then we can ensure that during those critical 100 hours, trading remains open and grids don't shut down, don't close down to others. That's an important point. We need to take a critical view of the development towards local flex markets. I think we're going to need exceptions, because otherwise we'll have problems during those critical hours. And we need a European debate in general around system stability. So something we've begun to do in Germany with our network operators and stakeholders, that kind of discussion needs to happen at European level, around the table. What do we need to achieve that system stability? And I think that needs to move up the agenda, the way we see it. So on the next slide, we have flexibility and Franco-German cooperation. Laurent has said a lot about that already. As we can see on the next slide, there is huge potential. I've shown you the picture for Germany, but it's similar across Europe. The more renewables enter the system, the more often we're going to have this pattern. A lot of PV, a lot of wind, very cheap prices. The power prices aren't reflected here very well in the chart, but those steps, which tend towards zero, and then from 6 p.m. in the evening, they rise again. We've had a price curve in the past that was high during the day and then fell away at night. But now we're going to get a camel with a short hump in the morning and then another hump in the afternoon and then down again in the evening and at night. As we live in a market economy, our system will sooner or later adjust to that new reality. It will have to, because we can save an awful lot of money. And if we don't, we're going to end up with very high power prices. If the system can offer cheaper power for so many hours, we need to go to adjust to that. Otherwise, our system will not be competitive, because we want to save money. So we need to open the door to ensure that as much use of those low prices as possible can be made by removing market barriers with more storage, a whole spectrum, flexible consumption. And for that too, we need a flex roadmap. The ground has been laid in the European rules, because if you combine this chart with more storage, this is where the viability lies in the future. So we're challenging all this, we're tackling all this, and we can see on the next slide that we're working on our flexibility report. We can see from the directive, we're removing the barriers, that's a priority. The underrepresented needs need to be prioritized. We need a uniform methodology so that we can quantify this flexibility and tackle those barriers. We think that removing barriers is more important than setting fixed targets like X gigawatts of flexibility, because that is hard to measure. What would the consumer have used if we had not taken this measure, so that we can define a baseline and so forth. So measures are more important than targets. And we need even more short-term time frames, we think, shorter, quicker settlement periods, so that we can handle those load ramps in the market. Okay, just to end briefly with a slide on Franco-German cooperation. It's very gratifying how we can work together. This is an issue where, although we're coming from different starting points and different systems, and have different requirements of those systems, France with its strong nuclear component, us with a lot of coal still, but phasing it out. So we're coming from different angles and we're going in different directions. We have different needs, but nevertheless, there is great consensus that both systems need flexibility to a very large extent. And what can we do together about that? What are our shared barriers? And we have a common understanding that we need an enabling framework for this demand response. And we will make a priority of overcoming those barriers. We've developed a number of product families that we want to work on, and the discussion will now be pan out into Penta, which is a good thing too. We'd like to say thank you for that initiative. That momentum should be drawn upon so that flexibility remains a top issue in Europe. So thank you very much. I think that's all I needed to say. Thank you for listening. Thank you, André Poschmann, for that presentation. You reminded us of a lot of the challenges and you talked about the importance of cooperation. I'm going to take one question because we're about to finish. We're supposed to finish at 1 p.m. It's been a very full morning. But we're looking at this reform and the simplification of capacity mechanisms. What was decided exactly on that? And how is that going to influence the possible introduction of a mechanism of this kind in Germany? We decided that we will introduce a capacity mechanism that is neutral in terms of technology, and it should be possible at the latest by 2028 and operational. As an interim stage, there should be a tender for power station capacity, our power station strategy, which will consist partly from hydrogen conversion and partly gas-fired stations. As far as the capacity market is concerned, we discussed a number of different models, notably the well-known central-decentral capacity market. Looking at our neighbors, we looked at experience with those. And at the end of the day, we decided at the ministry, together with our scientific support teams, that probably the most efficient would be to combine a central with a decentral capacity market. That is, a decentral capacity market that can draw on the local knowledge of players and also taps into a lot of the flexibility available there, but draws on it at a central level. But with a central tender, especially for investments that will require a very long-term refinancing period. So we're not looking there at 2 or 3 year introduction times or lead-in times for new products. So we need a combination for these two components. There are lots of details we could talk about to explain why we decided to go for this combination, but that's our idea. Also, so that flexibility can be made available and not to prevent things happening because we're too inflexible with our capacity. So there's still an awful lot to tackle, evidently. for this reform of European design. So thank you very much to André Poschmann, who is responsible for electricity and European energy matters at the German Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action, which brings us to the end of the morning and our Franco-German Energy Forum online. So let's take a break for lunch, and we'll be back at 2 p.m. with a lot more topics to address, the challenges, decisions on national level in terms of European dependence, interdependence. We talked a lot about resources this morning, and we'll be having a dialogue between representatives of the regulator in France and the regulator in Germany, the network agency, that is. So we've got a busy program this afternoon. Thanks for staying with us this morning. Thank you to the interpreters. Enjoy your lunch, and we'll be back at 2 p.m. for the next part of this forum on energy.